Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina, January 1948. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees below zero, and the town of Marshall lay buried beneath 4 feet of snow. 3 people had already died that winter, frozen solid in their beds, in their barns, on the short walk between house and woodpile. The cold had become a killer that moved through Madison County without mercy, claiming the old and the young, the prepared and the careless alike. Every chimney in the valley poured smoke into the gray sky. Every family huddled around their stoves, burning through firewood at 3 times the normal rate. And still the cold crept through the walls, through the floors, through every corner where wood met wood at sharp right angles. But high on a windswept ridge where nobody else had wanted to live, something impossible was happening. A cabin stood alone against the brutal sky, not a normal cabin with 4 walls and peaked roof, but something strange, something round, like a stone dropped by a giant hand onto the mountainside. Smoke rose thin and steady from its center, not the desperate, billowing clouds that poured from the rectangular houses below, but a modest stream that spoke of efficiency rather than desperation. Inside that round cabin, 2 teenage girls sat reading by lamplight. They wore wool sweaters, nothing more. No coats, no blankets wrapped around their shoulders, no visible shivering. A thermometer mounted near the door read 68 degrees. Outside, the wind screamed across the ridge at 40 miles per hour, driving the wind chill to nearly 50 below zero. Jessamine Ashford, 17 years old, turned a page in her grandmother's leather-bound journal. Her younger sister, Wren, 14, sat cross-legged on a handmade rug, sketching the frost patterns that had formed on the inside of the south-facing window. A copper-colored dog lay between them, his tail thumping lazily against the warm stone floor. 6 months earlier, the people of Marshall had called these girls crazy. They had laughed at the round walls rising on that impossible ridge. They had placed bets on how quickly the strange structure would collapse. They had shaken their heads and clicked their tongues and said it was a shame, really, 2 orphan girls building their own graves before they were even old enough to vote. Now those same people were dying in their sensible rectangular houses, while 2 teenage girls read books in their shirt sleeves. This is the story of how that happened. The trouble began, as trouble often does, with death. Samuel Ashford died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1943, killed by a white oak that twisted on its stump and came down wrong. He was 34 years old, a logging man who had spent his entire adult life reading trees, understanding their weight and lean and the hidden tensions in their grain. He had taught his daughters to respect the forest, to see it as a living thing that demanded attention and rewarded carelessness with tragedy. The tree that killed him was a tree he had read correctly. He knew it would twist. He had positioned himself in the safe zone, the place where decades of experience told him the trunk would not reach. But the oak had been hiding a secret, a hollow core rotted through by years of moisture seeping through an old lightning scar. When the saw cut deep enough, the tree did not fall. It exploded. Samuel's wife, Catherine, had died 4 years earlier, bleeding out in the back bedroom of their small cabin while giving birth to their second daughter. They named the baby Wren because Catherine, in her last moments of consciousness, had heard a wren singing outside the window and had smiled. The girl's grandmother, a woman named Morwenna Trelawney, had come from Cornwall, England, to help raise them after Catherine's death. Morwenna was 71 years old when Samuel died, and she became everything to Jessamine and Wren. Mother, father, teacher, protector. She was a small woman with silver hair and hands that never stopped moving, always building something, always fixing something, always improving something. She taught them things that nobody else in Madison County knew. Morwenna Trelawney had grown up in a fishing village on the Cornish coast, where her own grandmother had lived in a roundhouse built in the old Celtic style. Stone walls arranged in a circle, a roof like an upturned bowl. No corners where the wind could find purchase. No right angles where cold could creep through the gaps that inevitably formed when boards met boards at perpendicular joints. The people of Cornwall had forgotten most of this knowledge by the time Morwenna was born, but her grandmother remembered, and her grandmother taught her, and Morwenna, in turn, taught her granddaughters during the 4 years she had with them after Samuel's death. She taught them to read the wind the way other people read books. She taught them to understand how thick walls could store heat like a battery stores electricity. She taught them that air trapped in small spaces became the best insulation God ever created. She taught them that wood conducted heat along its grain far better than across it, and that this simple fact could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe when winter came. Most importantly, she taught them to question the assumption that the way everyone did things was the best way to do things. Morwenna died in September of 1943, 6 months after her son-in-law. The doctor said her heart gave out, but Jessamine knew better. Morwenna's heart had not failed. It had simply stopped. Overwhelmed by grief, unable to continue in a world where both her daughter and her daughter's husband lay buried on the hillside behind the cabin. The girls were alone then. Jessamine was 13, Wren was 10. Madison County sent them to live with their mother's sister and her husband, a man named Vernon Cross who owned a hardscrabble farm 3 miles outside of Marshall. Vernon was not a cruel man in the obvious ways. He did not beat the girls or starve them or lock them in closets. What Vernon did was simpler and perhaps more damaging. He made clear through 1,000 small cuts of indifference and dismissal that Jessamine and Wren were burdens to be tolerated rather than children to be loved. They slept in a drafty room above the barn. They ate after the family had finished, taking whatever scraps remained. They worked from dawn until dark, doing chores that Vernon's own children were too precious to perform. Jessamine watched and learned. She watched how Vernon's rectangular farmhouse leaked heat through every corner. She noted how the family burned through 3 cords of firewood each winter month and still huddled around the stove in heavy coats. She observed how wind found every gap where walls met at right angles, how snow drifted against the flat faces of the building until it blocked windows and doors. She remembered what her grandmother had taught her, and she began to understand why Morwenna had always shaken her head when she looked at the angular American houses. 4 years passed this way. 4 years of invisible servitude. 4 years of watching Wren grow thin and quiet, the spark in her eyes dimming a little more each season. 4 years of saving pennies and nickels from odd jobs, hiding them in a coffee can beneath a loose board in the barn floor. 4 years of waiting for the right moment to escape. That moment came on an October evening in 1947, 3 weeks after Jessamine turned 17. She was carrying water from the well when she heard voices from the parlor window. Vernon's voice and another man's voice she did not recognize. Something in the tone made her stop. Something in the careful way they spoke, as if discussing livestock rather than human beings. Jessamine set down her buckets and crept closer to the window. The stranger was a thin man in a city suit, and he was explaining the terms of a contract. A labor contract for textile mills in Tennessee. The mills were always looking for young workers, he said, young women especially. They had nimble fingers, good for the fine work, and the guardian received $15 per month until the workers reached the age of 18. Jessamine felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She knew about those mills, everyone in the mountains knew. The cotton dust that filled the lungs of the workers, turning their breath to rasping coughs by the time they were 20. The 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, the dormitories where disease spread like wildfire. The girls who went in healthy and came out broken, or did not come out at all. Vernon Cross was selling them, not their labor. Them. Selling them the way he would sell a pair of moles, except mules were worth more because mules did not have contracts that ended at 18. Jessamine did not confront him. She did not cry or rage or beg. She simply went back to her chores, and that night she told Wren everything. And 2 hours before dawn, they slipped out of the barn room with everything they owned in the world. $47 in coins and crumpled bills. Their grandmother's leather-bound journal. A hunting knife that had belonged to their father. A wool blanket each. The clothes on their backs. And Copper, the 3-year-old collie mix who had been their only friend on the Cross farm, refused to be left behind. He followed them into the darkness, his copper-colored fur invisible against the autumn leaves. His loyalty, the one thing Vernon Cross could not sell. They walked north through the night and into the next day, following deer trails and creek beds, staying off the roads where Vernon might send someone looking. By the time the sun reached its peak, they had covered nearly 10 miles, and Jessamine called a halt beside a spring that bubbled from a moss-covered rock. Wren collapsed against a fallen log, her thin frame trembling with exhaustion. She had not complained during the long march, but Jessamine could see the fear in her sister's eyes, the same fear that lived in her own chest, though she refused to let it show. Copper lay down with his head on Wren's lap, and the girl stroked his fur with hands that shook slightly. Jessamine pulled out their grandmother's journal. She had looked through it many times over the years, studying the detailed drawings of construction techniques, the careful notes about proportions and materials. But now, with the weight of their situation pressing down on her, she turned the pages more slowly, reading every word, looking for something she might have missed. She found it near the back of the journal, in a section she had somehow never noticed before. A hand-drawn map showing the mountains around Marshall with careful attention to elevation and orientation. And in one corner of the map, a circle drawn in red ink with notes written in Morwenna's precise handwriting. The place where the wind splits and rejoins, south-facing slope, morning sun to afternoon, spring water 50 yards above. The perfect site. If I were young again, I would build here. Jessamine stared at the map for a long moment. Then she looked at Wren, at the fear and exhaustion in her sister's face, and she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She was going to build the round cabin their grandmother had always dreamed of. If you are listening right now, I want you to pause and think about something. Two teenage girls, alone in the wilderness, with less than $50 and a journal of old building techniques. They had no power tools, no construction experience, no help coming from anywhere. Would you have believed they could build a house? Would you have bet on their survival? Write in the comments below what you would have done in their place. And tell me where you are listening from today. I read every single comment, and I want to know your story. It took them 2 days to find the spot marked on Morwenna's map. The ridge sat at nearly 4,000 feet elevation, a windswept shoulder of granite and thin soil that more sensible settlers had passed over for generations. A timber company had logged it bare in the 20s and abandoned it when the Depression made even cheap land worthless. Nobody had filed a claim in 20 years. Nobody wanted to. The wind up there blew constantly, a persistent presence that stripped heat from anything standing in its path. The soil was thin and rocky, barely enough to support the scrubby second-growth forest that had begun reclaiming the log slopes. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down the mountain. The nearest town was 7 miles by a road that became impassable with the first serious snow. Every practical consideration argued against building there. But Jessamine saw what her grandmother had seen 40 years before. A south-facing slope that would catch winter sun from dawn until mid-afternoon. A spring that bubbled from a rock face 50 yards uphill, providing year-round water that gravity would deliver without pumping. Granite outcroppings that could provide building stone without quarrying. Stands of young oak and hickory that the loggers had left behind, perfect for cutting and curing. Most importantly, she saw the pocket of calm air that her grandmother had marked on the map. The wind patterns on that ridge created something miraculous. The constant gusts split around a rock formation and rejoined downslope, leaving a small clearing where the air was almost still. A natural shelter, invisible to anyone who did not know how to look for it. Jessamine made camp in that clearing, and she did something that would have seemed fun to anyone watching. She waited. For 2 full weeks, she did nothing but observe. She noted where the sun rose and set, tracking how its angle changed as October progressed toward November. She marked the wind patterns with small flags made from torn cloth, watching how the gusts flowed around the rock formation at different times of day. She studied the drainage after a heavy rain, identifying where water pooled and where it flowed. Wren thought she had lost her mind. Her older sister spent hours staring at shadows, at rippling grass, at the behavior of leaves caught in invisible currents. She filled pages of a small notebook with diagrams and measurements that Wren could not understand. She seemed to have forgotten that winter was coming, that they had no shelter, that Vernon Cross might still be looking for them. On the 14th day, Jessamine finally spoke. "We build here," she said, pointing to a spot in the center of the clearing. "And we build in a circle." Wren stared at her sister. "A circle? Houses do not come in circles. This one will." The foundation came first, and it established the principle that would define everything they built. While rectangular foundations required precise right angles and corners that concentrated stress at specific points, Jessamine laid a circular foundation that distributed weight evenly around its entire circumference. She dug a trench 18 inches deep, working from dawn to dusk with a shovel that raised blisters on her palms within the first hour. Wren worked beside her, smaller but determined, moving stones from the granite outcroppings to the building site in loads that seemed too heavy for her thin arms. Copper watched them work, occasionally bringing sticks that nobody had asked for, his tail wagging with the simple joy of being included. The circle measured 24 feet in diameter. Jessamine had calculated the interior space carefully, using formulas from her grandmother's journal. A 24-foot circle provided over 450 square feet of floor space, roughly equivalent to a rectangular cabin measuring 20 by 23 feet. But unlike a rectangular cabin, every square foot of that space would be usable. No corners to accumulate cold air, no dead zones where furniture could not fit properly, no wasted space where walls met at angles that served construction convenience rather than living comfort. The foundation stones fit together without mortar, in the old Celtic way that Morwenna had described. Each stone chosen for its shape, rotated and adjusted until it locked with its neighbors, the weight of the wall above driving them tighter together rather than pushing them apart. It was slow work, back-breaking work, work that left both girls collapsed in their blankets each night, too exhausted even to eat the meager meals they could prepare over their campfire. But the foundation rose. Stone by stone, day by day, a perfect circle emerged from the thin mountain soil. Word spread through Madison County the way work had always spread in small communities. Somebody told somebody who told somebody else, and within a week, the story of the two crazy Ashford girls building a roundhouse on the ridge had reached every farm and store in the valley. The first visitors arrived in late October. Harlan Whitmore owned the building supply store in Marshall. He was 52 years old, with a face weathered by decades of mountain winters and opinions hardened by decades of never being wrong. He had lived in Madison County his entire life. His father had lived there before him, and his grandfather before that. The Whitmores knew how to build houses. They knew what worked and what did not work. They knew that round houses did not work. He rode up the mountain with his son Tobias, a broad-shouldered boy of 18 who had once tried to court Jessamine at a church social, and 3 other men from town. They dismounted at the edge of the clearing and stood with their arms crossed, their faces arranged in expressions of knowing amusement. Jessamine set down the log section she was fitting into place and wiped her hands on her trousers. "Well now," Harlan called out, voice carrying across the clearing with the confidence of a man who expected to be listened to. "What in the name of common sense are you girls building?" "A house, sir," Harlan laughed. It was not a kind laugh. "That is not a house. A house has corners, has proper walls, has a roof peak to shed snow." He shook his head, looking at the other men for confirmation of his wisdom. "That is a grain silo. You planning to store yourselves like corn?" The men laughed. Tobias laughed loudest, though something in his eyes suggested he was not entirely comfortable with the mockery. Jessamine remained calm. Her grandmother's patience lived in her measured response, in the way she refused to rise to the bait. "Corners are weak points," she said. "That is where cold gets in and heat gets out. A circle has no weak points." "A circle has no sense," Harlan replied. "How are you going to put furniture against a curved wall? How are you going to frame windows in a round structure? How are you going to put a roof on that thing?" Jessamine answered each question. Furniture could be built to fit curves or placed away from walls. Windows could be framed with angled cuts that accommodated the wall's curve. The roof would be a shallow cone supported by a central post and radiating rafters, easier to build than a peaked roof and far more resistant to wind. Harlan listened with the patronizing attention of a man who had already made up his mind. "Girls," he said when she finished, "I have lived in these mountains for 52 years. My daddy lived here before me and his daddy before him. We have been building houses the same way for generations because that is the way that works." He gestured at the circular walls rising from their stone foundation. "You are 17 years old. You have no money, no help, and no experience. And you are trying to reinvent something that does not need reinventing." He turned to leave, then paused. "First hard winter is going to teach you what your grandmother's fairy tales could not. When you are ready to build something proper, If you survive that long, come see me in town. I will help you find honest work." The men rode away, their laughter carrying back up the slope long after they disappeared into the trees. Jessamine returned to her work. The walls would not build themselves, and winter was coming. More visitors came in the days that followed. Marcus Pemberton was the most respected carpenter in Madison County. He had built half the barns in the valley and repaired the other half. When he rode up to inspect the construction, he spent an hour walking around the half-finished walls, examining the cordwood technique, testing the mortar with his thumbnail. His verdict was delivered with the certainty of expertise. "Structurally unsound," he announced. "No proper framing, no corner posts to bear the weight. These walls will buckle outward under the pressure of the roof." He shook his head sadly. "Give it 6 weeks, maybe less." Judge Cornelius Blackwood came with a different kind of warning. He was 60 years old, the most powerful man in Madison County, and he did not waste time with pleasantries. "I know who you are," he said, his voice cold as the November wind. "I know you ran from Vernon Cross. I know you are minors living without supervision on land you do not own." He looked at the round cabin with undisguised contempt. "If you do not have a proper dwelling by first snowfall, I will have no choice but to involve the authorities. Runaways belong in orphanages, not on mountainsides building pagan structures." Father Nathaniel O'Brien, the Catholic priest who served 3 parishes across the county, visited to express his concerns about the circular design. "Circles held certain connotations," he explained gently, "certain associations with practices that good Christian girls should avoid." He hoped they would reconsider. Agnes Cromwell did not bother making the trip up the mountain. She did not need to see the round cabin to know it was foolish. She had her restaurant in Marshall, and every table in that restaurant heard her opinion. "Those poor Ashford girls," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "building themselves a grave before they are old enough to know better. Someone should stop them. It would be a mercy, really." She shook her head and refilled coffee cups, spreading the story with every pour. "Mark my words. First real snow, that silly round thing will collapse. And then what? 2 frozen orphans and a county that has to pay for the burial." The men at her counter nodded and agreed. Agnes Cromwell was not a builder, but she knew people, and people built square houses for a reason. But not everyone came to mock. Ezra Hardin was 65 years old, a farmer who had worked the same land for 4 decades and remembered things that younger men had forgotten. He rode up the mountain alone on a gray morning in early November, his old mare picking her way carefully along the steep trail. He did not speak at first. He simply walked around the half-finished structure, studying the foundation, the cordwood walls, the careful way the mortar had been applied. His weathered hands touched the stones, tested the logs, felt the texture of the mortar mixture. Finally, he turned to Jessamine. "My grandmother was Welsh," he said quietly. "She used to talk about round houses, said they remembered the old ways in her village when she was a girl." Jessamine nodded. Ezra looked at the structure again, something like respect dawning in his eyes. "Round things last," he said. "Square things break." She used to say that too. He did not offer to help. He did not make promises or predictions. But when he rode back down the mountain, something in his posture had changed. He had seen something on that ridge that reminded him of wisdom he had almost forgotten. Opal Briggs came a week later. She was 78 years old, the oldest person in Madison County, a tiny woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen everything worth seeing in a long mountain life. She had known Morwenna Trelawney, had shared tea with her on winter afternoons, had listened to stories about Cornwall and the old Celtic ways. She stood at the edge of the clearing, leaning on a walking stick that had been carved from a single branch of mountain laurel, and she watched the Ashford girls work. After a long time, she spoke. "Your grandmother would be proud." That was all she said. But Jessamine felt tears prick at her eyes, and she had to turn away so that Wren would not see. Have you ever worked towards something that everyone told you was impossible? Have you ever kept going when all the voices around you said to stop? That is what these girls did. Day after day, week after week. They kept building while the world laughed at them. If you have a story like that, I want to hear it. Share it in the comments below. Tell me about the time you trusted yourself when nobody else did. And if you are enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe. I promise you, you will want to see how it ends. The crisis came in the third week of November. Wren had been growing quieter for days, her movements slower, her eyes duller. She still worked alongside her sister, but the energy that had sustained her through the first weeks of construction seemed to be draining away, replaced by something hollow and defeated. The nights were cold now, genuinely cold, and their campfire provided little comfort against the darkness that pressed in from all sides. They had not seen another friendly face in days. The skeptics had stopped coming, satisfied that they had made their point, content to wait for winter to prove them right. It was raining when Wren finally broke. She was carrying a load of stones from the outcropping, smaller than the loads Jessamine carried, but heavy enough for her thin arms. She slipped on the wet grass, went down hard, and the stones scattered across the ground. She did not get up. Jessamine ran to her, fear clenching in her chest, but Wren was not hurt. She was just lying there in the rain, staring at the gray sky, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. I cannot do this anymore. Her voice was small, lost, the voice of a child who had finally reached the end of her endurance. Jessa, I cannot. We are going to die up here. We are going to freeze to death in a round house that everyone says will not work. And the last thing I will see is this mountain that I never wanted to be on in the first place. Jessamine knelt beside her sister. The rain soaked through her clothes, chilling her to the bone, but she did not move. You dragged me up here, Wren continued, and her voice had an edge now, something sharp and hurting. You decided we would run. You decided we would build grandmother's crazy dream cabin. You never asked me what I wanted. Maybe Vernon was horrible, but at least we had a roof. At least we had food. At least we were not going to die. Copper had come to investigate, his wet fur plastered to his body, his brown eyes worried. He whined softly and pressed his nose against Wren's hand. Jessamine did not argue. She did not defend herself or explain her reasoning or try to convince her sister that everything would be all right. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out their grandmother's journal. Read this, she said. Page 112, near the back. Wren stared at her for a long moment, anger and exhaustion warring in her face. Then she took the journal and opened it with trembling hands. The pages were damp from the rain, but the writing was still legible. Morwenna's precise script, the same handwriting that filled the rest of the journal with construction techniques and building formulas. But this page was different. This page was a letter. My darling Wren, it began. If you are reading this, then things have gone badly wrong, and you are somewhere you never expected to be, doing something you never wanted to do. I know this is hard. I know it feels impossible. I know you wanted to give up. Do not give up. You have a gift, my little bird. You have eyes that see what others miss. You can read the wind and the water and the living things around you in ways that your sister cannot, in ways that I could barely teach because it cannot really be taught. It is simply there in you waiting to be used. Your sister has my knowledge. She has the formulas and the techniques and the understanding of how things are built. But you have something just as important. You have the wisdom to know when those formulas apply and when they do not. You have the ability to see when the world is not behaving the way the books say it should. Trust your sister. She loves you more than anything in this world. But also trust yourself, because there will come a time when your sight will save both of you, and when that time comes, you must be ready. I love you. I have always loved you, and I believe in what you can become. Your grandmother, Morwenna. Wren read the letter 3 times before she looked up. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart, and a shaft of late afternoon sunlight had found its way through, illuminating the half-built cabin in golden light. Copper licked the tears from her face. I did not know, Wren whispered. I did not know she wrote this. Neither did I, Jessamine admitted. I found it this morning. I was going to show you tonight, but then she gestured at the scattered stones, at the muddy ground, at the evidence of her sister's collapse. Wren sat up slowly. She picked up one of the fallen stones and turned it over in her hands, studying its shape, its weight, its potential. She saw something, Wren said quietly. Grandmother saw something in both of us. Yes. And she believed we could do this. Yes, she did. Wren was silent for a long moment. Then she stood up, still holding the stone, and looked at the round cabin rising from its foundation. The walls are not level on the northeast side, she said. I noticed it yesterday, but I did not say anything because I thought maybe I was wrong. Jessamine stared at her. You are not wrong, she said slowly. I measured this morning. We are off by almost 2 inches. I have been trying to figure out how to fix it without taking down what we already built. Wren walked to the northeast section of the wall and studied it for a long moment. Her eyes moved over the logs and mortar, seeing something invisible to anyone else. It is the foundation, she said finally. The stones shifted after that heavy rain last week. Not much, but enough. If we add a wedge here and here, she pointed to 2 specific spots, the wall will settle back into true. Jessamine looked at her sister as if seeing her for the first time. How do you know that? Wren shrugged, something like her old spark returning to her eyes. I do not know how I know. I just see it. Like grandmother said. They worked together until dark, adding the wedges Wren had specified, watching the wall slowly return to level. When they finally stopped, exhausted but no longer defeated, the round cabin stood true and straight against the darkening sky. That night, huddled under their blankets with copper warm between them, Wren spoke one more time. I am sorry, she said, for what I said about you dragging me here. Jessamine reached out and squeezed her sister's hand. You were not wrong, she said. I did drag you here. I made the decision and you had to follow. But Wren, I could not leave you behind. I could not let Vernon sell you to those mills. I could not. I know, Wren said. I know why you did it. I was just tired and scared. I am scared too. The words hung in the darkness between them, an admission that Jessamine had never made before. You are? Wren asked. Every single day, Jessamine said. I wake up scared and I go to sleep scared, and in between I just keep working because if I stop, the fear will swallow me whole. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then she shifted closer to her sister, sharing warmth in the cold mountain night. Then we will be scared together, she said, and we will keep working together. And when the cabin is done, we will be warm together while everyone who laughed at us freezes. Jessamine smiled in the darkness. That, she said, is exactly the plan. The first week of December brought an unwelcome visitor to the ridge. Sheriff Morrison was a practical man who had held his position for 12 years by avoiding trouble rather than seeking it. He did not want to ride up to that ridge. He did not want to confront 2 orphan girls about their living situation. He did not want to be the one who dragged them back to civilization or shipped them off to an orphanage in Asheville. But Judge Blackwood had made a formal complaint, and formal complaints required formal responses. He found the girls working on the roof structure, a cone of radiating rafters meeting at a central post. The walls were complete now, rising 8 feet from the foundation, solid and strange, and unlike anything Morrison had ever seen. The roof was half finished, the cone of rafters reaching toward a central post that would hold everything together. He dismounted and stood at the edge of the clearing, his hat in his hands, his discomfort obvious. Miss Ashford, he called out, I need to speak with you. Jessamine climbed down from the ladder she had been using and walked to meet him. Wren stayed where she was, watching from above with Copper alert beside her. Sheriff, Jessamine said. Her voice was polite but guarded. You know why I am here, I can guess. Morrison sighed. Judge Blackwood says you girls are runaways. Says you are living in conditions unfit for human habitation. Says he has a duty to protect minors in this county, and that duty requires him to act. Jessamine did not respond immediately. She looked back at the round cabin, at the work of 2 months rising from the mountain soil, at her sister perched on the half-finished roof with their loyal dog. Did the judge tell you why we ran? She asked finally. Morrison shook his head. Does it matter? It matters, Jessamine said. She told him about Vernon Cross, about the labor contract, about the textile mills in Tennessee, and the girls who went in healthy and came out broken or did not come out at all. Morrison listened with growing unease. He knew Vernon Cross. Everyone knew Vernon Cross. A hard man, people said, but honest. A man who did what needed doing. But this, can you prove any of this? Morrison asked. I cannot prove what I heard through a window, Jessamine admitted. But you could ask Vernon about it. You could ask him if a man in a city suit visited his farm 3 weeks before we left. You could ask him what they discussed. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. The wind gusted across the ridge, carrying the first real cold of the approaching winter. Miss Ashford, he said finally, I have a job to do. Judge Blackwood expects me to bring you back, to put you somewhere proper until you turn 18. Jessamine held his gaze. Sheriff Morrison, she said, this cabin will be finished by the end of the month. We will have shelter. We will have warmth. We will have everything we need to survive the winter. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Give us until March 1st. If by March 1st this cabin has failed, if we are in danger, if our situation is truly unfit, then we will come with you willingly. We will not fight. We will not run again. And if the cabin succeeds, then I would ask you to leave us in peace, to let us live our lives on this mountain, harming no one, asking nothing from the county except to be left alone. Morrison looked at the round cabin again, at the solid walls, the careful construction, the obvious competence that had gone into every detail. He was not a builder, but he could recognize good work when he saw it. March 1st, he said, if that structure is still standing on March 1st, and you girls are still healthy, I will not bother you again. Thank you, Jessamine said. Morrison put his hat back on and mounted his horse. Before he rode away, he paused and looked back. For what it is worth, he said, I hope you make it. This county could use more people willing to do things different. Then he was gone, picking his way down the mountain trail, leaving the Ashford sisters to their impossible task. The roof went up in the last 3 weeks of November. It was not a peaked roof like every other cabin in Madison County. It was a cone, shallow and elegant, supported by a central post and 16 radiating rafters that met at the apex like the spokes of a wheel. The pitch was only 15 degrees, far flatter than conventional wisdom said was safe. Every builder in the valley had told Jessamine that a roof that flat would collapse under the weight of accumulated snow. They had explained the physics with the patient condescension of experts educating a fool. Snow weighs heavy. Flat roofs cannot shed it. She would wake up one morning buried under the debris of her own folly. But Jessamine knew something they did not. A shallow pitched roof on a circular structure does not accumulate snow the way a peaked roof does. The wind flowing over curved walls creates a consistent uplift pattern that sweeps the roof surface clean. Snow that lands is lifted and scattered rather than piling into drifts. The circular shape had no valleys, no corners, no places where snow could accumulate and stress the structure. Jessamine had watched her grandmother's descriptions come to life in her mind, had seen the wind patterns on this ridge with her own eyes, had trusted the knowledge that Morwenna had trusted before her. The door faced southeast, positioned to catch morning sun while avoiding the prevailing northwest winds. A single large window faced due south to maximize the low winter sun that would stream through it and warm the interior. The deep windowsill would let sunlight penetrate far into the room when the sun sat low on the horizon. A small wood stove occupied the center of the single room, its chimney rising through the peak of the conical roof. The central placement was deliberate. Heat from the stove would radiate in all directions equally, warming every part of the circular space. No hot zones near the fire and cold zones in distant corners. Just even, consistent warmth throughout. They moved in on November 28, 1947. The temperature outside was 18 degrees. Inside, with a small fire burning in the central stove, Jessamine recorded a reading of 62 degrees on the thermometer she had salvaged from their father's old cabin. She wrote the numbers in her journal, the first entry in what would become a detailed record of temperatures and fuel consumption through the long winter ahead. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge, bringing the promise of the coldest months to come. Inside, two sisters and their copper-colored dogs settled into their new home, warm and safe in a structure that the whole county had promised would kill them. The blizzard began on December 23rd. It came down from Canada with a fury that the oldest residents of Madison County had never seen. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The wind rose to 50 miles per hour. The snow fell so thick and fast that by nightfall, the world had disappeared into a white nothing. And it did not stop. For 9 consecutive days, the temperature did not rise above zero. On the worst night, December 27th, the thermometer in Marshall read 12 degrees below zero, with wind chill pushing the effective temperature to nearly 50 below. People began to die. Old Thomas McAllister, who had survived every winter for 78 years, was found frozen in his bed on Christmas morning. His fire had gone out sometime in the night, and the cold had taken him before he could relight it. 2 children from the Brennan family died on December 28th. They had gone out to the barn to check on the livestock and gotten lost in the white blindness of the storm. Their bodies were found 30 feet from their back door, buried in a drift that had accumulated in minutes. A young mother named Sarah Carver delivered her baby in a house so cold that the water in the basin froze before she could wash the blood from her hands. The baby survived. Sarah did not. Throughout Madison County, the story was the same. Families burned through their winter firewood in days rather than weeks. Houses that had seemed adequate for decades proved barely sufficient against this kind of cold. The rectangular walls leaked heat through every corner. The peaked roofs accumulated snow until they groaned under the weight. The doors froze shut, the windows iced over, and the cold crept in through gaps that had gone unnoticed for generations. Harlan Whitmore exhausted his firewood supply by January 15th. He had planned for a normal winter, had calculated his needs based on 40 years of experience, and the experience had failed him. He was forced to buy more wood at 3 times the autumn price, and still his family huddled in the kitchen, the only room they could keep above 40 degrees. His son Tobias developed frostbite on 2 toes during a desperate trip to the outhouse. The same boy who had laughed loudest at the Ashford girls now lay in bed, face pale with pain, wondering if he would ever walk normally again. The doctor said he might lose them. Marcus Pemberton's roof collapsed on January 3rd. The snow had accumulated faster than even a proper steep pitch could shed, and the ridgepole had snapped like a dry twig under the accumulated weight. The family escaped, but they lost nearly everything they owned. Judge Blackwood's wife took ill with pneumonia from the constant cold in their drafty house. The judge himself had to sleep in his courtroom for 3 nights because his own home was uninhabitable. Jessamine marked the days on a piece of bark nailed to the wall. December 23rd, December 24th, December 25th. Christmas came and went unnoticed, marked only by an extra ration of dried apples and a prayer that Wren whispered into Copper's fur. January 1st, January 15th, February 1st. The deadline Sheriff Morrison had set was March 1st. If the cabin failed before then, they would lose everything. Not just the structure, but their freedom. The orphanage in Asheville waited for girls who could not take care of themselves. The cabin did not fail. The cabin performed exactly as Jessamine had predicted. Her daily records told the story in simple numbers. Inside temperature never below 62 degrees. Firewood consumption 1/3 of what her neighbors used. The mathematics of survival, written in a leather-bound journal. On the coldest days, when Harlan Whitmore's rectangular farmhouse required 40 pounds of firewood to maintain a barely tolerable 45 degrees, the round cabin stayed at 65 degrees with only 30 pounds of fuel. When Marcus Pemberton burned through his entire winter woodpile in 3 weeks, the Ashford sisters' carefully stacked supply barely diminished. The thick cordwood walls absorbed heat from the daytime sun and the evening fire, then released it slowly through the night. The girls could let the fire die down after dinner and still wake to a comfortable 55 degrees the next morning. The curved walls deflected the wind instead of fighting it. While rectangular houses groaned and creaked as gusts found their corners, the round cabin sat silent and solid, the wind parting around it like water around a stone. The shallow roof swept clean of snow, just as Jessamine had known it would. No drifts accumulated, no dangerous weight pressed down on the rafters. The structure that everyone had promised would collapse stood stronger than any building in the county. Here is something I want you to think about. Those people freezing in their proper houses, the ones who laughed and mocked and bet against 2 orphan girls. They are suffering now. Some of them are dying. If you were Jessamine, would you help them? Would you open your door to the man who called you crazy? Would you share your warmth with people who wanted you to fail? Think about that. Really think about it. And tell me in the comments what you would do. because what happens next will show you exactly who Jessamine Ashford really was. Ezra Hardin made the journey on January 18th. He had argued against the mockery at Harlan's store, though not loudly enough to matter. But the thought of two teenage girls frozen to death troubled his conscience, and he finally decided he needed to know for certain. The ride up the mountain nearly killed him. The trails were buried under 4 feet of snow, and his old mare struggled through drifts that reached her chest. The wind cut through his heaviest coat like it was made of paper. By the time he reached the ridge, his hands were numb, and his face felt like it belonged to someone else. What he found defied everything he had ever believed about construction, survival, and the proper way to live in the mountains. The round cabin sat in its clearing like a stone that had grown from the mountain itself. The curved walls shed the weak winter sunlight. The shallow roof was swept clean of snow, just as the Ashford girl had predicted. No drifts had accumulated against the walls. No ice dams had formed along the roofline. The structure looked almost warm. If a building could look warm. Smoke rose from the central chimney in a thin, steady stream that suggested efficient burning rather than desperate consumption. Ezra dismounted on numb legs and stumbled to the door. He knocked, not sure what he would find inside, half expecting to discover two frozen corpses and a dead dog. Jessamine Ashford opened the door wearing a light wool sweater. No coat, no gloves, no visible shivering. Behind her, Ezra could see the cabin interior glowing with warmth. The central stove radiated heat that seemed to fill every inch of the curved space. Wren sat at a small table, reading a book. Copper lay on a braided rug, his tail wagging at the visitor. "Mr. Hardin," Jessamine said, genuine surprise in her voice. "Please come in. You must be frozen." Ezra stepped inside and stopped. The warmth hit him like a physical force. Not the searing blast of a roaring fire, but a deep, even heat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The curved walls radiated warmth. The stone floor held residual heat from the stove. The air itself felt different, still uncomfortable in a way Ezra had never experienced in any cabin during winter. "What temperature is it in here?" he managed to ask. 68 degrees, Jessamine replied. "I checked it an hour ago." She pointed to a thermometer mounted near the door. The mercury stood exactly where she had said. Ezra stared at the instrument. 68 degrees. Outside, it was 4 below zero. His own farmhouse, with 2 fireplaces burning constantly, could barely maintain 45 degrees in this cold. And these girls, these teenage orphans everyone had laughed at, were living in shirt sleeves. "How much wood are you burning?" Jessamine walked to the stove and opened the door. Inside, a modest fire consumed 2 small logs. "We fire it twice a day," she said, "morning and evening. About 30 pounds of wood total." 30 pounds. Ezra burned that much every 3 hours during cold snaps like this. His family went through nearly a cord per week in severe weather, and they were still cold. He reached out and touched the wall. It was warm, genuinely warm, like sun-heated stone in summer. He had never felt anything like it in winter, not in 65 years of living in these mountains. Ezra Hardin rode down from that ridge, a changed man. He stopped at every farm along the way, telling anyone who would listen what he had seen. A round cabin maintaining nearly 70 degrees in below zero weather. 2 girls burning a quarter of the wood that everyone else used and staying twice as warm. Construction techniques that turned everything they knew about building upside down. At first, people dismissed him the way they had dismissed Jessamine. Ezra was known as a quiet, fanciful man, prone to exaggeration when he got excited. A round cabin that stayed warm with almost no fire. Obviously impossible. But the cold continued, and the suffering mounted, and eventually curiosity overcame skepticism. Harlan Whitmore made the journey on January 20th. His family was in crisis. His wife sick with a cough that would not stop. His son Tobias lying in bed with blackening toes, the doctor coming every day to check if amputation would be necessary. His wood supply exhausted, and his money running low from buying more at inflated prices. He had sent word to relatives in Tennessee asking if they could take the family in until spring, but travel was impossible in these conditions. He came to the ridge not out of humility, but out of desperation. If the Ashford girl had found something that worked, he needed to know about it. His family's survival depended on understanding what she understood. He arrived to find Jessamine outside the cabin, splitting wood with easy efficiency. She was wearing a heavy shirt but no coat, comfortable in temperatures that had Harlan hunching into his collar and stamping his feet. He did not apologize for his earlier mockery. He was not that kind of man. But he asked questions. Genuine questions, with something approaching respect in his voice. Jessamine showed him her records, the daily temperature readings she had maintained since moving in, outside temperatures ranging from 12 below to 41 above, inside temperatures never falling below 62, never requiring more than 2 daily firings of the small central stove. Wood consumption roughly 1/3 of what comparable rectangular cabins used, documented and measured over nearly 2 months of the hardest winter anyone could remember. Harlan studied the numbers in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of the bluster that usually characterized his pronouncements. My boy Tobias might lose 2 toes from frostbite. My wife has been sick since Christmas with a cold she cannot shake because the house will not stay warm. I have spent more on firewood this winter than I usually spend in 3 years. He looked at Jessamine with eyes that had finally learned something about humility. Would you teach me how to build one of these? There is a moment in every story when everything changes. This was that moment. Jessamine Ashford could have said no. She could have reminded Harlan of every cruel word he had spoken, every dismissive laugh, every prediction of her failure. She could have let him suffer the way he had been willing to let her suffer. But that was not who she was. That was not who Morwenna had raised her to be. Bring your family here, she said. Bring anyone who needs shelter. We have room. Harlan stared at her. You would take us in, after everything I said? Jessamine smiled, a small smile, tired but genuine. Mr. Whitmore, she said, my grandmother did not teach me to build this cabin so I could watch people freeze. She taught me because knowledge is meant to be shared, because warmth is not something you hoard, because the whole point of learning to do things better is so that everyone can do things better. She turned toward the cabin door. Now come inside before you lose more than your pride. Within 3 days, 17 people were living in the round cabin. Harlan Whitmore brought his wife and son, Tobias and daughter. Marcus Pemberton, whose roof had collapsed, brought his family of 5. 2 elderly widows from town, a young couple with a newborn baby, old Opal Briggs, who had walked 3 miles through waist-deep snow because she refused to burden her neighbors and trusted the Ashford girls to take her in. 17 people in 450 square feet. By any reasonable calculation, it should have been unbearable. Crowded and stifling and thick with the tensions of forced proximity. Instead, it became something else. The curved walls created no corners where people could isolate themselves, no separate spaces where factions could form. Everyone faced the center, faced each other, faced the warmth that radiated from the small stove that somehow kept them all comfortable. They shared meals from pooled supplies. They shared stories through long winter nights. They shared the simple human truth that survival requires community, and that community requires setting aside the petty differences that seem so important when times are easy. Jessamine answered every question about the cabin. She explained the principles, the techniques, the calculations. She never talked down to people who had once talked down to her. Wren sat with the children, telling them stories, keeping them calm, using the strange gift her grandmother had recognized to sense when someone needed comfort before they even knew it themselves. Copper moved among the refugees like a furry ambassador, offering his warmth to anyone who needed it, letting the Whitmore daughter cry into his coat when she was frightened, sleeping beside old Opal Briggs to keep her thin bones warm through the night. Tobias Whitmore, his frostbitten toes wrapped in clean bandages, watched Jessamine teach his father about construction. The same girl he had laughed at 6 months ago now explained concepts that no one in his family had ever considered. He felt something shift in his chest. Not quite shame. Something more complicated. Something like the beginning of respect. Father O'Brien, who had come on the 5th day seeking shelter for 3 parishioners who could not survive in their own homes, led evening prayers that mentioned nothing about pagan circles or suspicious structures. He spoke instead about providence, about unexpected grace, about the young women who had been called foolish, but who had saved his flock. On the ninth day, the storm finally broke. The wind died. The snow stopped falling. The clouds parted to reveal a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The refugees emerged from the round cabin to survey a world transformed. The snow lay 5 feet deep across the ridge, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. The temperature was still cold, 15 degrees below zero, but the cruel wind was gone. They looked out at the valley below and saw smoke rising from chimneys throughout Madison County. The survivors signaling their presence, beginning the process of digging out and counting losses. Harlan Whitmore stood beside Jessamine at the edge of the clearing. The journey down would be difficult but possible. His family would survive. His son would probably keep his toes, the doctor said, thanks to the warmth they had found in time. His wife was already recovering. I was wrong. He said the words slowly, each one costing him something he had carried his entire life. I was wrong about you. Wrong about this cabin. Wrong about everything I thought I knew about building and survival and the way things ought to be done. He turned to face Jessamine directly. I called you crazy. I told everyone in the county that you were building your own grave. I laughed at you and mocked you and waited for you to fail. His voice cracked slightly. And then you saved my family. Jessamine met his gaze steadily. Mr. Whitmore, she said, I did not build this cabin to prove you wrong. I built it to keep my sister and myself alive. The fact that it could help others was just a bonus. She looked out at the white expanse of the ridge, at the mountains that had tried to kill them all and failed. My grandmother used to say that the old ways are not old because they stopped working. They are old because they worked for so long that people started to take them for granted, started to think they knew better, started to believe that new was always improvement and different was always wrong. She turned back to Harlan. You were not wrong to be skeptical. A 17-year-old girl building a round cabin on a mountain ridge, it does sound crazy. Your mistake was not in doubting me. Your mistake was in refusing to watch and learn when the evidence was right in front of you. Harlan nodded slowly. Will you teach me, he asked. Not just tell me how, but actually show me, so I can build one for my own family? Jessamine smiled. I will teach anyone who wants to learn, she said. That is why my grandmother wrote everything down. Knowledge dies when you keep it to yourself. It lives when you give it away. Have you ever had to forgive someone who did not really deserve it? Have you ever helped someone who hurt you, not because they earned your kindness, but because kindness was simply who you were? That is what Jessamine did. That is what her grandmother had taught her to do. If you know someone like that, someone who gives more than they receive, someone who helps without keeping score, I want you to think about them right now. And maybe when this story is over, reach out to them. Tell them what they mean to you. Life is short. Winters come. The people who warm us deserve to know they are appreciated. Sheriff Morrison returned on March 1st, exactly as he had promised. The winter had broken by then, though snow still lay thick across the mountains. The roads had been cleared enough for travel. The county was beginning to assess the damage, count the losses, figure out how to rebuild. Morrison found the round cabin exactly as he had left it 4 months before. Solid, warm, inhabited by 2 healthy teenage girls and their copper-colored mom. He also found 7 other people there. Refugees who had decided not to leave when the storm ended. Families who had realized that the Ashford girls' round cabin was a better place to spend the rest of the winter than their own damaged homes. Miss Ashford, Morrison said, removing his hat, I believe I owe you an apology. No apology necessary, Jessamine replied. You were doing your job. Morrison shook his head. I was doing what Judge Blackwood told me to do. That is not always the same thing as doing my job. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. This is a deed, he said. Official recognition of your claim to this land. 40 acres, including this ridge and the spring above it. Judge Blackwood signed it himself this morning. Jessamine took the document with hands that trembled slightly. How? She asked. We did not file a claim. We do not have the money for a land purchase. Morrison smiled. Let us just say that the judge had a change of heart during that storm. Seems his family spent 3 nights in this cabin when their own house became uninhabitable. Seems he developed a new appreciation for unconventional construction methods. He glanced around at the curved walls, the efficient stove, the evidence of knowledge that had outlasted everything the winter could throw at it. He also suggested that perhaps the county should stop questioning the living arrangements of young women who clearly know more about survival than most of the men in Madison County. Spring came slowly to the Blue Ridge Mountains that year. The snow melted, the creeks ran high with meltwater. The forests began their annual resurrection, buds swelling on branches that had seemed dead for months. And on the ridge where Jessamine and Wren Ashford had built their impossible cabin, something else was growing. 3 new round foundations were laid that spring. Harlan Whitmore built the first one, following Jessamine's instructions precisely, asking questions constantly, learning the techniques his ancestors had forgotten generations ago. Marcus Pemberton built the second, determined to construct something that would never collapse under snow again. He modified Jessamine's design slightly, adding extra thickness to the walls, and discovered that the modification improved efficiency even further. Ezra Hardin's grandson Silas built the third. He was 20 years old, quiet and competent, and he had been leaving supplies at the edge of the Ashford clearing for months before anyone knew who he was. "My grandmother was Welsh," he told Jessamine when he finally introduced himself properly. "She used to tell stories about round houses in the old country. When I saw what you were building, I knew it was real. I knew it would work." There was something in his eyes when he looked at her, something that went beyond admiration for her construction techniques. Jessamine noticed. She filed the observation away for later consideration. There would be time for such things. But first, there was teaching to do. By the following winter, 7 round cabins stood in Madison County, each one slightly different, adapted to its specific site and the preferences of its builders. But all of them shared the core principles that Jessamine had learned from her grandmother. Circular walls to eliminate weak corners, thick walls to store and release heat, central heating to warm evenly, proper orientation to catch the winter sun. The county agricultural extension agent visited in the fall of 1948. He brought instruments to measure wall insulation values, temperature differentials, and heating efficiency. The numbers he recorded found their way into a university study, then into agricultural bulletins distributed throughout the Appalachian region. Jessamine Ashford, the orphan girl who had been thrown away by the only family she had left, became a quiet authority on construction techniques most people had forgotten existed. She never sought fame or recognition. She never patented her methods or tried to profit from them. When people came to learn, she taught them freely, the way her grandmother had taught her, the way knowledge had always been passed in the mountains before money complicated everything. In 1950, Jessamine married Silas Hardin. The ceremony was small, held in the round cabin where they had first truly met, where Silas had finally admitted that he had been watching her build from afar, leaving supplies because he believed in what she was doing even when no one else did. Wren stood as her sister's witness. Copper, gray around the muzzle now but still loyal, lay at their feet throughout the ceremony. Father O'Brien officiated. The same priest who had once warned Jessamine about the pagan implications of circular construction now spoke about the sacred geometry of creation, about how God made the sun and moon as circles, about how love itself was a ring without beginning or end. Jessamine Ashford Hardin lived in her round cabin for 62 years. She raised 4 children there, each of them learning the building techniques their mother had learned from their great-grandmother. She taught hundreds of students over the decades, sharing knowledge freely with anyone who asked, never charging for wisdom that she considered a gift to be passed on rather than a commodity to be sold. Wren became a teacher. She moved to Asheville and spent 30 years educating mountain children, always including lessons about the old ways her grandmother had taught. She never married, but she never seemed lonely. She had her students, her sister's growing family, and regular visits to the ridge where she had learned that impossible things were only impossible until someone did them. Copper died in 1960 at the age of 16. They buried him beside the round cabin with a stone marker that read, "He was warm when others were cold. He was loyal when others laughed. He was loved." In 1978, researchers from North Carolina State University came to the ridge. They had read about the round cabin in old agricultural bulletins. They had heard stories from county extension agents about a structure built by teenage girls that had outperformed every conventional building in the region, during the terrible winter of 1947 to 48. They came with modern instruments, thermal imaging cameras, digital temperature sensors, computer models that could calculate efficiency ratings to 6 decimal places. What they found confirmed everything Jessamine had recorded in her grandmother's journal 60 years before. The round cabin's efficiency was 2.4 times higher than conventional rectangular construction of the same era. The cordwood walls with their special mortar provided insulation equivalent to 12 inches of modern fiberglass. The circular shape reduced heat loss by exactly the 12% that Jessamine had calculated with pencil and paper in 1947. The old ways worked. The science proved it. Jessamine Ashford Harden died on a quiet morning in March of 2009. She was 79 years old. She had outlived her husband by 3 years, her sister by 2. She had seen grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She had watched the techniques she preserved spread throughout the region and beyond, influencing architects and builders who had never heard her name, but who benefited from her grandmother's wisdom nonetheless. She died in the round cabin, in the bed she had shared with Silas for nearly 60 years, surrounded by the curved walls that had kept her warm through more than 6 decades of mountain winters. Her children found her at peace. Her grandmother's leather-bound journal, open on the nightstand beside her, turned to the page where Morwenna had written about the perfect site on the ridge where the wind split and rejoined. "If I were young again, again, the note said, I would build here." Morwenna never got that chance. Her granddaughter did. The round cabin still stands today. The Madison County Historical Society maintains it now, offering tours to visitors who want to see the structure that defied a generation of experts and saved 17 lives during the worst winter in 20 years. The cordwood walls are as solid as the day Jessamine laid them. The roof cone has never needed major repairs. The foundation stones have not shifted in 3/4 of a century. If you visit on a cold day, if you step in shade and feel the warmth radiating from those ancient walls, you might understand something that cannot be captured in textbooks or scientific papers. You might understand that knowledge does not become obsolete just because it is old. You might understand that the wisdom of our grandmothers was not superseded by the wisdom of our experts. You might understand that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is remember what everyone else has forgotten. This is the story I wanted to share with you today. A story about 2 girls who had nothing except knowledge in each other. A story about a community that laughed until it learned. A story about warmth and cold, pride and humility, the old ways and the new ways. But most of all, this is a story about trust. Jessamine trusted her grandmother. Wren trusted her sister. And eventually an entire county learned to trust the evidence of their own frozen fingers over the confident predictions of experts who had never been wrong until they were. If you are facing your own winter right now, if the cold is creeping in and the people around you are telling you that your strange round cabin will never work, I want you to remember this story. Build anyway. Trust the knowledge that was passed to you. Trust yourself. The people who are laughing now may be the same people asking for shelter later. And when that happens, when they come to you humbled and freezing, let them in. That is what warmth is for. If this story touched you, if it made you think about the wisdom we have lost and the knowledge worth preserving, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things by trusting themselves when no one else would. And leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. I read every single one, and I am always moved by the community we are building here. A community of people who believe in warmth. A community of people who remember. A community of people who build in circles when everyone else insists on corners. Thank you for listening. Stay warm. The end.